Hi everyone and welcome to this tutorial. In the past few tutorials we've learned some theory about MVC and about struts2, and we've also set up a project using a struts2 library. So in this tutorial we're all set to develop a bare bones struts2 application. So just to quickly recap what we've seen so far, a struts2 MVC framework and an application that uses the struts2 MVC framework would consist of some important components. One is the struts XML and the interceptors. We have action classes and we have JSPs that use tag libraries, and of course action classes call certain business service methods to do the actual work. This is an overall high-level picture of a struts to MVC web application. But since we're developing a small bare bones struts2 application in this tutorial, we're going to stick to the essentials. We'll try to remove some of the elements over here initially, and we'll learn what they are and we'll add them later. So the first thing that I'm going to remove now is the business service classes and the business service methods. Ideally, what would happen is your struts2 classes and the action classes would be like a view layer in front of your business service layer. So say you have a business service layer that performs certain actions. The view layer, which is comprised of the struts2 MVC layer, would be talking to the business service to get the actual work done. So that is an ideal situation, but in this scenario, in this application, we are not going to be having any business service classes. The action class will just say, it'll print a hard-coded message. This is just to start, and then we'll see how to integrate with business service methods later on. And let's take the JSPs. We're not going to use any tag libraries for now. We'll just have a simple JSP that again prints a simple static message. So we have a simple message, static message printed in the action class. We have a simple static message printed in the JSP, so we don't need any of this. And the third thing that I'm going to eliminate are the interceptors. Well, we're not really eliminating because interceptors are included in our struts application by default. And if we don't do anything, they're going to be integrated in a default setting. We can configure and override the default setting, and we're going to look at what interceptors are and how to override the defaults later on. But for now, we're just going to ignore this, but it is going to be there by default, so we don't have to worry about that at this point of time. So having eliminated all these components, we are left with three main components: the action class, JSP, and the struts XML. So the main components are the action class, the JSP, and the struts2 XML. So these are the three components that we're going to write in our simple struts2 application, and we're going to see how they interact with each other and they talk to each other. So this is going to be a high-level overview of our simple web application. So we're going to develop these three components now. So most of the interaction between these three components is primarily carried out by the controller, and we configure how the interactions happen by using the struts XML. So we're going to look at that first. We're going to learn what the struts2 XML does. The struts2 XML is concerned with taking a client's request and then finding out which is the action class that needs to execute. So this is similar to what we've seen in servlets. In servlets, you have the web XML. And what the web.xml does is it has configuration about a particular URL and a particular servlet. So if there is a particular URL request coming from the client, then the web.xml will know which servlet needs to be called to address that particular request. So depending on the URL, the right servlet is and the right method of that servlet is called. So struts2 XML does something similar, but here we do not have servlets. We actually have action classes. So struts2 XML, it controls the execution flow of the request, and what it does is it maps a URL, an input URL, to action classes. So we'll look at what the methods of the action classes are, in a little while. But the primary goal of this mapping is to take the input URL of the client. The client makes a URL request, and then it maps it to a particular action class, and a method of that action class executes to serve that client request. The second thing that the struts2 XML does is it also maps to JSPs, and this is something that we're going to look at in a few minutes. But let's focus on the mapping between the URL and the action class for now. Let's say I want to write an application that that fetches tutorial websites. So you want to get a list of tutorial websites, and I'm writing a web application for that. So I can have a URL to an action class mapping like this. So let's say I have published a URL in my web application called get tutorial. So it's going to be http mywebapp.com or whatever / get tutorial. Now what I'm going to do is in my struts to XML, I'm going to map it to a tutorial action class. So I'm going to write an action class called tutorial action, and then I'm going to say whenever any client, whenever any user submits this URL, request for this URL, get tutorial, execute a method of this action class. So this is the URL to action class mapping that I'm going to specify in my struts XML. And of course, this does not have to be one. You can have multiple mappings like this. Say I have a couple more URLs. I have a get books, which fetches all the books that a user is interested in, and I have a book action that takes care of getting that response. And I have a get seminars URL, and then I have a seminar action that addresses that URL request. So I can have multiple URLs mapped to multiple action classes. And this is the information that I will store in my struts to XML. Again, it's analogous to web.xml mapping URLs to servlets, but there are a few differences that we're going to look at in a little while. So again, this a little picture about this concept. So a client makes a request. Now what the struts XML will have is the URL which the client has requested, and it's going to look up which action class needs to execute, and then it's going to call a method of that action class. So this is the first configuration that we're going to make in our struts XML. Now the question is, which method of the action class needs to execute? In the servlets example, what would happen is you have HTTP methods. You have a HTTP GET or a HTTP POST, and then based on that, you would have different methods in your servlet, which says, a method like do GET or a method like do POST. And then, the servlet container has its job very simple, depending on the request. If it's a GET request, call a do GET. If it's a POST request, call a do POST. But in this case, we have something slightly different. We have action classes, and they are not actually tied to the get or the post methods directly. So how does the struts framework know which method to call? Well, there are a couple of configuration items over here again, but by default, there is a method called execute. So if you're writing an action class, if you have a method called execute, then that is the method that is called when you do the mapping. So we can have other methods configured when we look at them later, but right now we're going to stick to the default execute method. So what's going to happen is whenever a client makes a request, say my client is making a request for get tutorial, it's going to look at the action class. Which action class should I call? It's tutorial action. Then it's going to execute the method called execute. So this is the default method that the struts framework calls whenever there is a request. So now with this configuration in the struts XML and with this action class, we have an initial flow established from the client request to a method execution. This is not sufficient to have a complete request response cycle to execute, but this is something that we can get started on. So let's open up our Eclipse and at least code the first path that we understand so far. Okay, so I have my Eclipse open here with the default web project. Of course, we included our struts2 library in the previous tutorial, and it has a web directory which has the important web.xml, and I think that's about it, nothing else. The web.xml has a few welcome file lists, index, default, all combinations. Unfortunately, none of them are there in this project at this time, but let's not worry about that. What we'll do is we'll focus on the struts XML and the action class. So those are the two things that I would like to create in this project. So let's start by creating the struts XML. I will create the struts XML inside the src folder. It has to be inside the class path, and I can create it in the src folder. Let me do that now. I'll choose new, other. I want an XML file. I'll choose XML file here. I'll call this struts.xml. and finish. Now this is the blank XML file, of course, with the header. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a small snippet of the struts XML from somewhere else. I'm going to paste it over here. So this has the doc type and the DTD. So this is a good starting point for us. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce the struts tags. So every struts XML will have the starting and closing struts tag. So all our configuration is going to be in between these two tags. So between these two struts tags, we'll specify the mapping between a URL and an action class. So let me go ahead and create an action class also. So I'll click on source, new, let's say class. I'm going to use the same the use case, a get tutorial URL calling a tutorial action. So I'm going to create this action class in my usual package, and I will append action to it. So all my action classes are going to go into our Kaushik Java Brains action. I'll call this tutorial action and click finish. Okay, so in my tutorial action, we need to have a default method called execute. We already discussed about that. That's the method that is going to get called when struts reads that a tutorial action has to get triggered based on a user request. So I'm going to create this execute method over here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this a public, and I'm going to put a return type as string. We'll look at why this is string in a little while, but this is going to be my signature for the execute. So this has to be the signature for the default execute that the struts framework triggers. So you have to have a public string execute. And again, as I said, we're going to look at the reason why it's a string in a little while. So I'm not going to do anything much over here. I'm just going to do a sysout, and I'm going to say hello from execute, so that we know that the execute method has been called. And of course I have to return something. I'm going to return a blank value as of now, because we still haven't covered the significance of this string return type. We're going to look at that in a little while, but this is good for starting. So I have an execute method which returns a string, and I'm just printing out something so that I can know from the logs if this method has been called when we come to a point where we execute this project. So now in my starts XML, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try, I'm going to map a URL to this tutorial action. So there are a couple of tags that I will add to my struts XML now. The first tag that I'm going to add is called the package. I have a package, name is default, and it has an extends, and it extends struts default. This is again something that we're going to look at in a little while, so let's not worry about that now. So I'll just close the package tag here. Okay, so inside the package tag is where I'm going to be doing the mapping, and again we're going to look at the significance of this package tag in the next, well, maybe not next, but in the subsequent tutorials. So here, now let me specify the mapping. I want to map get tutorial to tutorial action. This mapping is called action mapping in the struts2 language. So this is done by using an action tag. Now an action tag has something called as name, which is the name of the action, the name of the request that a client makes in the browser. So I will call this get tutorial. So this is a request that the client makes in the browser. Of course, it has to be a full URL for the client, but here the root context of the web application is already decided. So I'm just going to use this name to specify the rest of the URL after the root context. So get tutorial is going to be the URL, and then what I will do is I will use the class property of this action to specify the class name, which is tutorial action over here. So I'll specify the name. Tutorial action. So this is my class to which a URL getTutorial is mapped to, and of course the default method that executes is this execute. So now we have mapped the URL to the action that we have seen. Now if I run this project, I'm probably going to get a million errors because there are a lot of things that we have to do yet. So this is just the first step, and this covers what we have seen so far. In this picture, we have a URL to the action class mapping. So this is happening fine now.